Hey guys, so right off the bat, I'd like to preface this with the statement that there's not really such a thing as humane slaughter, and I'd also like to take this opportunity to virtue signal and let everyone know that I'm against cutting off the heads of animals for snacks. Just in case anyone didn't know that, because I know a lot of unapologetic vegans who are writing me mean comments right now would most certainly strawman me and claim that I am, in fact, in favor of bloodshed. So I'm not. I'm against slaughtering animals. You might have noticed from my YouTube name, I think it's wrong to kill animals. So now that that's out of the way, let's get to the real meat of the matter. So I'm going to start off by distinguishing between two meanings of the word humane. There's humane in itself, and slaughtering someone is not humane by that definition. But there is another alternative definition of humane, which is humane relative to the alternatives, which is obviously what we're talking about when we're talking about humane slaughter or humane treatment of farmed animals. Whenever we talk about an animal welfare organization, we're talking about the second definition of humane, which is humane relative to the alternatives. So now I'll just give you a quick run through of this organization's history, what they're doing right now, and why animal activists should support their work. HSA was founded in 1911, and they work on research, training, and development to improve the welfare and reduce the suffering of animals during transport and slaughter. The main things that they do are they provide free technical information for people in these industries. They train these people to reduce suffering in their slaughterhouses or the slaughterhouses which supply their restaurants or institutions. They consult with governments in order to help them enact more humane treatment of animals, and they also fund research into less painful ways of slaughtering animals and handling them. HSA is based in the United Kingdom, but they also work internationally, particularly third world ones, to enact more humane treatment of animals. 2017 Open Philanthropy Project gave them a $500,000 grant to try to implement more humane policies in China. Now, they are a welfarist organization as opposed to an animal rights organization, but that should not prevent us from supporting them. Strategically, as a welfarist organization, they're not perceived as a threat by these industries, and that enables them to confidentially consult with them and help them reduce the suffering of the animals which are going through their slaughterhouses or institutions. In 1920, HSA introduced and demonstrated the use of mechanical stunning, which became widespread and led to the eventual adoption of the UK Slaughter of Animals Act of 1933. Before this legislation was put in place, animals were typically sliced up fully conscious or pole-axed to death. Now, a pole-axe is a giant wooden cudgel, so you can imagine the suffering associated with that. 1960, Canada adopted similar legislation. HSA is currently developing a much more humane alternative to carbon dioxide gassing of pigs, and they're also researching more humane methods of slaughtering fish, crustaceans, and cephalopods. In 2017, the Open Philanthropy Project gave them a $2.5 million grant to further their research on this topic, because as we know, sea animals are the number one victims of slaughter, and they tend to be slaughtered far more painfully than other animals, and no other large, well-funded organization is working on demonstrably reducing the suffering of these animals. So now I'll just go ahead and dive into the objections which are inevitably going to come up, and the first one, and the most easy to debunk, is we should only be advocating for veganism. Now, this form of argument usually comes from the very dogmatic, deontological Francione school of thought called Abolitionism, and I'm going to link below to a very interesting ethics paper called Why Abolitionism Collapses into Welfarism and What It Means for Animal Rights, in which the author very incisively deconstructs Francione's amorphous and incoherent abolitionist position, and describes what the author calls the abolitionists' dilemma, which I'll now briefly summarize for you. Abolitionists claim to hold some sort of deontological position, yet when questioned about why they don't support welfare reforms, present a consequentialist argument claiming that these welfare reforms do not actually reduce suffering. When an abolitionist is confronted with a welfare reform which actually would reduce suffering, they face the abolitionists' dilemma. they either support that welfare reform, or they're forced to concede that no amount of suffering reduction trumps philosophical dogmatism, an eccentric position which most people would consider highly immoral and an absurd conclusion of that reasoning. Humane slaughter presents us with the abolitionists' dilemma. We know for a fact that it reduces suffering, and so we must either support it or prioritize philosophical dogmatism above suffering reduction. And I'll just conclude this point by observing that it's pretty easy to object to something like lethal injection on obscure philosophical grounds when you're not the one facing execution by flaying. The second objection is that welfare advancements delay the onset of a vegan world, and while this is a more consequentialist, reasonable argument, it doesn't hold much water. So if we actually take this claim seriously, we're saying that not reducing suffering is justifiable if it makes more people go vegan in the future. And if this is true, why not take it to the logical conclusion? And why not advocate for animals to be treated even worse in even more shocking ways, so that even more people will go vegan faster? None of us would support something like that. Just because we support something like abolition does not mean that we support its advancement at any cost. Secondly, it's not entirely obvious that abolition will come about for moral reasons as opposed to technological ones. In the coming years, we could see an end to animal farming, due entirely to technological advances and environmental concerns. In other words, it might not actually matter whether we used an abolitionist or a welfarist message in the years leading up to that. And in that case, all of the suffering which we could have prevented but chose not to was all for naught. Moving on to the next objection, a lot of people are concerned that once slaughter becomes sufficiently humane, people will be okay with it. And while that might sound persuasive on its face, I don't think there's a lot of substance to this. Now I'll call your attention to one of the most humane methods of slaughtering animals, which, according to most people, is the most horrifying, and I'm talking about chick culling. Chick culling is probably the least painful method of slaughter, and yet, according to most people, it's one of the absolute worst things that happens to animals. This next objection typically comes from the Francione types, and that's that we are telling people it's okay to hurt animals by supporting something like this. Well, firstly, just because we support humane by the second definition, meaning humane relative to alternatives, privately or institutionally, does not in any way compel us to bring in this definition of humane during activism. We can stick with the first definition, humane in itself, and help people understand that there's nothing humane in itself about slaughtering someone for a snack. And we can even bring in the shortcomings of the implementation of humane slaughter, such as poorly trained staff, line speed, lack of oversight, to help people understand that, as a practical matter, it's impossible to implement effective humane slaughter wide scale, and so the industry should just be abolished. Secondly, the very assertion that vegan support of welfare reform indicates to non-vegans that we're okay with bloodshed for snacks is nothing more than baseless speculation on the part of Francione and those who have unfortunately swallowed his propaganda. I really encourage you to simply ask non-vegans what your support of welfare reforms indicates to them, and you'll very quickly find out that most non-vegans, more readily than many vegans, will understand that it's morally consistent and reasonable for animal rights people to support suffering reduction interventions. So this last point encompasses all of the others, but I think it deserves a response in its own right, and that's this idea that animal welfare slows the momentum of animal rights. And there's no evidence for that. In fact, according to a study by Mercy for Animals, increased rates of vegetarianism are associated with increased farmed animal welfare across countries in the EU and within the United States and within the Netherlands. This isn't really surprising because animal welfare causes a society-wide conversation about some of the interests of animals to take place. And the more seriously people take some of their interests, the more people will come to recognize other interests that they have, such as an interest in continuing to live. Also, most importantly, humane treatment of farmed animals is a practical impossibility wide scale. And what we'll most likely see is one welfare reform followed by another until the industry is de facto illegal. In Germany and Switzerland, welfare restrictions are so restrictive on fur farms that it is de facto illegal, and will likely reach a similar situation for all farmed animals if, of course, in vitro options don't replace them beforehand. There's a lot more to be said about how welfare reforms actually advance abolition, but I could make an entire other video about that. And if anyone's interested, I'd love to hear from you. If you disagreed with anything I said, please hold nothing back, comment, share this with your unapologetic friends. And of course, consider, please, committing to a monthly donation to an effective animal charity of your choice, maybe even Humane Slaughter Association. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later!